He's not a bad boy because he made me see. Ah, breaking my heart.
We challenge you to a rumble. All out once and for all, except
On what terms?
whatever terms you're calling. You crossed the line once too often.
You started it.
Who jumped Baby John this afternoon?
Who jumped me the first day I moved here?
Who asked you to move here?
Who asked you?
Who where you was?
Back where you came from.
Spix, Mick.
What?
The movie and the plays, presidents would not be the ones that would organize the rumbles. The rumbles were always organized by the warlords or war counselors. Some people call them war counselors. They would meet separately and then decide what, where, and when, and of course, how many. Sometimes the rumbles would be organized to the point where, oh, we're only going to have 15 guys apiece or 20 guys apiece. So this would be something that was done by the war counselor ahead of the actual fight. Sometimes they would just go over there and just attack them, surprise attack on the enemy. But many rumbles were organized. The police were always vigilant in trying to stop these rumbles. As a matter of fact, that's how they knew that the rumble was coming, because it was already organized. In some cases, they had, like, I call them snitches on the street, or a gang member who says, I think my brother's going to get hurt, or maybe it's a non-gang member. There's going to be a rumble tonight at 10:30. Stop them. They're going to be at the corner of so-and-so. So in some cases, the police had some information about the rumble ahead of time, and then they would try to head them off at that point. Sometimes the snitch or the informant would give wrong information, and the police would be in the wrong place at the right time, so to speak.
The 1950s is a time rightfully lauded as an era of family values. It was also a time of social change, both within American society and in pop culture, both of which resonate today. However, human nature is a constant for any time period, and the 1950s, being occupied by human beings, was concerned with the same social ills that have plagued humanity since the beginning of our existence. These were issues of poverty, social unrest, political instability and agendas, and crime. To deny that violent crime was a concern of 1950s society, to downplay or even state that such incidents did not exist or were supposedly unimportant, is to deny ourselves our ability to learn about our shared humanity and to hopefully reduce or even prevent such acts from occurring again. For both the highest aspirations of human kindness and the worst examples of the dark side of human nature have always existed side by side throughout humankind's existence. It is true today, and it was also true during the good old days of the post-World War II era of the late 1940s through the early 1960s, and during the actual decade between those two, that was the golden age of America. To leave out the bad parts of history is to actually dismiss the concerns that society of the past held, or to learn from the lessons that they left us. It is with this spirit that we present this series, True Crimes of the Atomic Age, the 1950s. armed youth gang violence, ethnic rivalries and racial strife, generational conflict, direct clashes with law enforcement, urban street crime, death. These were subjects that the 1950s press emphasized as they and their late 50s era news reading public followed the events, the increased incidents of gang violence that would eventually lead up to the Forsyth Street Boys Sportsmen gang war of August 22 and 23 of 1959. These were subjects that 1950s newsreaders associated with the youth gangs of their era. And yet, for many modern-day senior citizens who would have grown up as preteens and teenagers at the time that the 1950s press covered the August 1959 gang wars, the subjects of street crime and armed violence are what defines all that is negative about today when compared to the trouble-free youth of the 1950s. It is as if 1950s society saw itself in a way that is completely the polar opposite to the way many, though not all, of today's modern-day senior citizens who grew up during the 50s remember the mood of that decade. Before we explore in detail what exactly occurred on the evenings of August 22 and 23, 1959, which took the lives of 14-year-old Julio Rosario and 15-year-old Theresa G, while severely injuring several other young people, many of whom were innocent bystanders, a brief exploration of mainstream late 1950s American youth culture, which existed at the same time as the youth gang conflicts, would help us to view that gang war within the context of the larger American youth culture. A brief interview with today's senior citizens would also help us to understand what role, if any, that 1950s news stories, particularly stories about people within their own age, had upon them, including real-life late 1950s tragedies, such as the Sportsmen Forsyth Street Boys gang war of 1959. During that same summer of 1959, the clean teen culture dominated the American mainstream youth market thanks to the genius of Dick Clark and his leveraging of the local Philadelphia-based American Bandstand TV show as the forefront of a teen youth culture that was clean-cut, fresh-faced, and overwhelmingly suburban and upper-middle class. Clark's regulars on American Bandstand, local Philadelphia teens such as Pat Mulletary, Billy Cook, Kenny Rossi, Arlene Sullivan, Carol Scaldaferri, Eddie Kelly, and arguably the most popular couple in the show, Bob Clayton and Justine Pirelli, led the teenage world of late 1950s America, suburban 1950s America, that is, in the way of fashions and dance steps, as the popular and unpaid regulars rubbed shoulders on Dick Clark's show with Bob Marcucci's stable of clean-cut and wholesome teen idols, Frankie Avalon and Fabian, along with other would-be contenders, all of whom would attempt to fill the vacuum left by the first wave of rock and roll stars who met their ends, whether career-wise or literally in plane or automobile crashes, run-ins with the law, scandals involving adultery with underage minors, or even induction into the U.S. Army.
Beginning his 2-year Army hitch, courtesy of the Memphis Draft Board. Like any ex-civilian raw recruit, the king of rock and roll will be keeping time to non-hip bugle calls. Involuntarily retired, a gyrating guitarist's departure from the public eye left his blue jean fans all shook up, so we hear. But Elvis doesn't seem to mind at all.
Two of the top movies of 1959 starred former model-turned-actress Alexandra Zook, a.k.a. Sandra Dee, in A Summer Place, a story of troubled upper-crust New England teenagers caught in the throes of passion, even as their own parents were engaged in extramarital affairs, and Gidget, a coming-of-age, light-hearted romantic comedy that was the prototype of the later beach party films of the mid-1960s put out by American International Pictures that would star former teen idols Mouseketeer Annette Funicello and Bandstand boy Frankie Avalon. Gidget was based on the 1957 novel by Frederick Kohner and was itself inspired by his daughter Kathy, in fact a cousin of the actress Susan Kohner, who actually worked with Sandra Dee in Imitation of Life that same year, and Kathy's relationship with Southern California beach bums and the surfing subculture. 1959's Gidget also illustrates the rift and the invisible wall that separated 1950s teens. One of the taglines for the advertising materials for Gidget included the following:
Columbia Pictures' Gidget, brought to the screen from the bestseller that proves a teenager can be delightfully juvenile without being delinquent.
Delightfully juvenile without being delinquent, a reference to the earlier juvenile delinquent films from 4 years earlier, such as Rebel Without a Cause and Blackboard Jungle, when compared with the harmless wholesomeness of Gidget, which itself was promoted by Dick Clark. And it was that reference to delinquency that underlined the other 1950s teen world, a world that most 1950s suburban teenagers were generally unaware of, that of inner-city fighting youth gangs, who existed at the same time as the wholesome clean teen culture marketed by Dick Clark, and for whom Clark's clean-cut teen image for his regulars was an answer for parental fears regarding harder-edged rock and roll and the association with harder-edged teens. While many suburban teens of upper-middle-class America embraced Dick Clark, that was not necessarily the case with teens of the street culture of the 1950s inner city, as related in the recollections by the author of Mockingbird, a Puerto Rican warrior on the streets of New York.
Could you elaborate on the kind of music that the Bops listened to, the kind of rock and roll they did not like, and the whys? The why.
Okay, they would listen to songs, for example, like the Italians, you had the Capris, there's the Moon Out Tonight, things like that. Then you had the Blacks, the French Lyman, the Spaniards. And the Italians and the Blacks would get along in music. They had groups that respected each other. And a guy by the name of Alan Freed, you familiar with Alan Freed?
Yes.
Well, Alan Freed, he's the king. He's the one that coined the word rock and roll.
Yeah.
And he would have both white and black, but they all sounded nice sounding music. Whereas Dick Clark would put on what we didn't like Frankie Avalon, Fabian, stuff like that. There was one girl in my neighborhood that she was cute. We talked to each other. I stopped talking to her when she came home one day with an IFIC button. IFIC button is when you went on Dick Clark's Saturday night show, they used Flavorific, and they would go like this. Oh my God, that would drive me insane. No, you weren't cool. You had to be like the Cadillacs, the Flamingos, the Teenagers, the Dubs. And that's what we were into.
So there was a clear line between like what the Bops listened to and what I'm guessing these were mainstream, what do you call it, upper middle class suburbanites who liked Dick Clark.
We call them Patties, the Patty Boys.
Yeah.
It was the doo-wop and rhythm and blues music culture that was represented at the old Trinity Mission, St. Augustine's at the Dance of August 22, 1959 in Manhattan, as it was that working-class youth culture that embraced the more streetwise music. The clean teen culture of Dick Clark's American Bandstand, the films of Sandra Dee, and for that matter, the upper middle class's embracing of car culture, hot rods and customs, is what is primarily remembered by today's senior citizens of middle-class suburbia, since then as now, the middle class was and is the majority culture of America, including among its youth. Then there's the very real fact that the vast majority of 1950s and early 60s young people, including that era's teenagers, generally did not follow the news events of their youth of the 50s and early 60s. At least, not in the way that they do now. with their following of today's current events as adult senior citizens, with this interview of a group of seniors being one example. Did teenagers in the 50s generally pay attention to the news, yes or no?
No.
Yeah.
Nobody paid attention. And it's better than I know. Especially if it wasn't in your area. That's right. You know, I mean, maybe you heard what was happening in your neighborhood, but not anything beyond that. No. We were just interested in dancing and going to proms, you know, that kind of thing. I think.
What really listen to the news on the radio and the TV wasn't pretty well non-existent.
That's true. Absolutely. And you don't read the paper.
When you recall the post-war era, the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s, do you go by personal memories or do you go by research? Little bit.
You call it research.
Yeah.
It's just glancing at articles and go, okay, and moving on.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it was done.
Personal memories. I mean,
I'd say personal.
Yeah, definitely. Just my memories, right?
Yeah, some personal memories as well.
Yes.
If we say a name like Cape Man, does that mean anything to you?
No.
Yeah. Michael Farmer, does that name mean anything to you? But if we say a fictional movie like Rebel Without a Cause,
Oh, yeah. Of course. You know.
or West Side Story, that means something to you. If we say Forsyth Street Boys, Sportsmen, or even Los Gavilanes, which was in San Francisco.
those I know.
So most of you were here in the Tri-City, or
No, San Francisco. And the peninsula.
San Francisco.
Connecticut, San Francisco,
Missouri.
Missouri. Okay.
Canada.
Canada.
You asked me to be here.
Okay. For those of you in San Francisco, do the terms Barts, white shoes, or Muns, or Pachucos mean anything?
Pachucos and white shoes. Pachucos and white shoes.
Okay.
Pachucos, but that's the only one I can recall.
Bops means nothing to you, right? Yeah.
Is that a dance?
The bop is a dance, a bop is a gang member. Yeah, okay. How familiar do you feel individuals in the late 70s to late 80s age range who would have been teenagers during the 1950s and early 60s, how familiar do you feel they would be with 1950s era crime cases and court cases, such as that of Salvador Agron?
I think people today, especially, or in the 80s or 90s, they wouldn't really know what we were talking about. Their parents would, because their parents were subjected to all of the media that was going on at the time. But again, that really points to the need for historical accuracy and narratives that really make some kind of sense.
August 22, 1959. It is a Saturday evening, and the Old Trinity Mission is hosting a teenage dance, a record hop, in which Kilmer Meyers Lower East Side Neighborhood Association is the major sponsor. Members of various neighborhood gangs were invited to attend in a show of peace. The understanding was that the dance hall itself was the location of a cool, a truce halting, at least temporarily, physical confrontations between opposing gangs. However, just 2 days before the dance, on that Thursday of August 20, 1959, 17-year-old Miguel Castro, a leader of the Sportsmen, and John Cruz, also 17 years old, engaged in a fistfight. Cruz was the leader of the Forsyth Street Boys. The outcome of that fight is disputed, with newspaper accounts after the tragic events to follow stating that Castro got the best of John Cruz. Other accounts dispute this, noting Cruz, one of 6 siblings living with his twice-married single mother, Carmen Marquez, had actually been a competitive amateur boxer in Puerto Rico. Regardless of the outcome of that fight, it was just one more step towards tragedy days later. Both gang leaders would figure prominently in the events to come, which
2 days after the fistfight would escalate, ironically enough, at that teen record hop, which Myers and his Lower East Side Neighborhood Association had intended to curb gang violence. At the Saturday dance, 2 days later, a boy, whose name is now lost to history, a member of the Sportsmen, added fuel to the growing fire by dancing with a Deb, a girl gang member who belonged to the Forsyth Street Boys. A heated argument ensued between the two groups over the Sportsmen boys dancing with a Forsyth girl. However, in observance of 1950s New York youth gang protocol, as the dance was the location of a temporary truce, settlement of this perceived act of disrespect would have to wait until after the dance. That wait wouldn't be long in coming. The following morning, Sunday, August 23, 1959, 10:30 a.m., Sarah Delano Park, officially a public space. Unofficially, the park was deep into Forsyth Street Boys' turf or territory. Miguel Castro would lead a group of about 8 or so sportsmen in a raid, japping, according to 1950s New York youth gang parlance. John Cruz would be struck in the head with a car antenna, and he and Castro would have another fight. The outcome of this Sunday morning fight is not in dispute, with Cruz utilizing his boxing experience to not only recover from the cutting blow of the car aerial, but with assistance from his Forsyths, drive off the attacking sportsman. A Deb of the Forsyths would later go to the Palestine Theater that afternoon, which was a part of Sportsman turf. Spying in, she overheard some members of the Sportsmen angrily working themselves up for another raid into Forsyth turf at Sarah Delano Park. The girl promptly returned to Forsyth turf, informing John Cruz and the other Forsyths that another raid by the Sportsmen, a retaliatory strike for their initial failed attempt that morning, was coming later in the night. The Forsyths had a nylon 22 rifle as part of their arsenal, held in possession by another of their leaders, 17-year-old Nestor Juan Cintron. Cruz retrieved it and strategically hid the rifle in the park. The Sportsmen did indeed return to the park that evening, armed with their improvised firearms, zip guns, as well as knives. But the Forsyths were ready. Cruz took out the hidden rifle and fired. The Sportsmen also fired their zip guns and made use of their knives. In the ensuing and violently confusing melee, 14-year-old Forsyth Julio Rosario would be mortally wounded, stabbed in the back. An 11-year-old innocent bystander taking an evening ride in his bike, Manuel Cintron, would be shot in the face. 17-year-old Luis Santos would also be shot, and another 14-year-old stabbing victim, Victor Gonzalez, would join Julio Rosario, stabbed by 13-year-old Sportsman member Samuel Adams, before his fellow invading sportsmen, led by Miguel Castro, would run off in the face of the Forsyths' counterattack. Like all real-life armed battles, the affair was brutal, bloody, and a complete mess. Emotions also were running high, regardless of who won or who lost the encounter. With his blood running hot, particularly with the stabbing of Julio Rosario, ostensibly a surrogate younger brother of Cruz's gang under his protection, the 17-year-old gang leader then gathered several of his Forsyths for a vengeance raid into Avenue D, the heart of Sportsman turf. Armed with a nylon 22 rifle, as well as improvised Molotov cocktail firebombs, they piled themselves into a car and angrily sped off towards the Lillian-Walled housing projects, the heart of Sportsman turf. At the Lillian-Walled housing projects, outreach workers from Kilmer Meyers' Lower East Side Neighborhood Association had called an impromptu gathering, attended by about 20 or so local teenagers. Emotions were also running high there, since the dance that previous night, and Lena's outreach workers were calling on the teens to keep the peace, the raid at the park having just occurred and still unknown to them. Among the gathered teens were 16-year-old Robert Combs, 15-year-old Ernestine Singleton, and another 15-year-old girl, Theresa G., the former girlfriend of Frank Brother Boyd, a leader in the Sportsmen gang whose criminal record and reputation for brutality and ruthlessness contrasted with Theresa's reputation as a serious-minded high school student with plans for eventually getting into healthcare and out of the hood. Cruz and his Forsyth Street boys drove up around the corner and quietly got out, Cruz's rifle in hand, their presence undetected by the crowd in front of the housing projects. With a gesture, Cruz signaled his boys to toss the lighted cocktails, igniting the night sky and setting flame to the bench where the group of teens had milled about. With screams of panic, the teens ran. Several shots rang out from Cruz's gun, the first to the pavement and the second in the air, scattering the teens, as if the fire at the bench wouldn't do the job. Then he started firing into the crowd. Ernestine Singleton was felled with a shot that tore into her hip, dropping her to the pavement while she screamed in agony. Robert Combs would be shot and wounded. Theresa G., on the other hand, didn't have time to scream in agony. Cruz's bullet ripped into her skull. She was dead when she hit the pavement. Cruz and his Forsyth Street boys would flee the scene of the crime, but less dramatic than what is usually depicted in many 1950s fictional juvenile delinquent movies, he would be picked up at his home. When informed of the charges against him, Cruz would, tearfully, state that he didn't know that he was shooting at a girl. The shooting murder of 15-year-old Theresa G. was tragic, and she was not the only unintended victim of gang violence that night. 15-year-old Luis Morales, walking with a girl, was attacked and severely beaten, while his girlfriend was slapped around, though again, according to reports, both were examples of innocence mistaken for being gang members. 23-year-old Donald Fitzgerald was attacked and stabbed, in another example of a bystander mistaken as an active participant by the two warring gangs that night. As for the aforementioned 14-year-old Julio Rosario, who was an active member of the Forsyth Street Boys, stabbed in the back during the Roosevelt Park fight, he would linger for 3 days, passing of his wounds on August 25th, Tuesday evening, in front of his vigilant mother, Dolores. As mentioned, Theresa G. had actually dated one of the Sportsmen's leaders, brother Frank Boyd. Prior to the shooting, she had assured her parents, Walter and Johnny May, that she wasn't serious about any boy, that she simply wanted to finish high school and become a nurse. It also seems that her dating Boyd had no bearing on her being shot by Cruz, as he had claimed that he actually did not know that he had shot the girl. It is a claim that seems to be supported by the physical makeup of the Lillian-walled housing projects and the surrounding neighborhood.
On the location, if a car was even going at just 25 miles an hour, John Cruz and his crew, they would not have been able to tell who was there, whether it was man, woman, child, because they came screaming around the corner. They were coming east on Houston Street, making that turn onto Avenue D. From the corner to the actual opening where the shots were fired, it's probably only 50 feet, the length of a building. And then you have another 35, 40 feet to where her body was. So if they're coming around, and even if they stopped and jumped out of the car, they would not have had time to notice the different people that were there.
Fired blind?
Yes, that's what I believe. When John and Cruz were picked up by the police, they said, we didn't know that we had shot any women. As a matter of fact, they had shot two young women. So they couldn't tell. When they threw the firebomb, even though it lit the place, they immediately just started firing.
As is all too typical, Cruz's mother couldn't believe that her son had been involved in the shooting, despite his previous record of being arrested for extortion. Saturday evening, August 29, 1959. A scheduled dance in celebration for St. Augustine, sponsored by St. Augustine's Episcopal Church, was replaced by a funeral procession attended by over 250 residents of the Lower East Side. Myers led the procession. The Right Reverend railed against New York City officials for their apathy that, at least in part, helped to contribute to the Sportsmen Forsyth gang war, which possibly, he felt, could have been prevented, had funds for professionals in the fields of youth outreach and mental health care not been cut off. During the services for Theresa at the Trinity Church, Myers now addressed the gangs and their families. If you cared about her, let this be your memorial to her. Let there be no more sudden death on the streets of the Lower East Side. Banish all thoughts of retaliation. Let no more innocent people fall to these streets. Myers' words did not fall on deaf ears. Though the sportsmen vowed vengeance, Lena and the parents moved quickly to defuse the situation, as police protection was granted to the family of Julio Rosario following several threatening phone calls directed towards his brother, who the caller stated would be next. Lena arranged for camps far out of town, and the parents spirited away the individual gang members who were the most inclined to launch revenge raids, or who would have had to organize or participate in raids. One member of the Sportsmen had actually requested that Lena take him away so he could back out of leading a raid without appearing to be a chicken or coward. He slept on the floor at the house of one of Lena's outreach workers, so that early morning, the next day, he could be spirited away to one of their camps, away from the trouble. The strategy worked. Theresa G. and Julio Rosario were gone, their lives lost, but the deaths, in this gang war at least, would end with them. The other teenagers injured and wounded in the conflict, no doubt, carrying the emotional wounds for years to come. With the leaders of both gangs either taken out of town to Lena's camps till emotions cooled, and John Cruz on trial for murder, no further raids would commence. The Sportsmen Forsyth Street Boys gang war was over. One could say that Myers, at least in stopping further reprisals, had won, though it was a bitter victory, with 2 young teens dead and several others seriously wounded. Myers would later move across the country, serving as Bishop of the Diocese of California in the Episcopal Church from 1967 to 1979. His liberal approach to Christianity made him a highly controversial figure in San Francisco's religious and political milieu, in much the same way that his gang outreach had made him a controversial figure in New York. However, between 1955 to 1959, he was able to keep a temporary peace between opposing youth gangs for 3 years. And when that peace shattered, he and his Lower East Side Neighborhood Association, LENA, were able to prevent further gang reprisals while containing the violence. Ironically, as Kilmer Meyers' calls for peace on the Lower East Side seemed to calm tensions in the wake of the murders of Theresa G. and Julio Rosario, 2 days later, on Tuesday, August 25, 1959, a little more than 13 miles to the east, where the Lower East Side gang war had just occurred in Manhattan, Jamaica Queens was where a 14-year-old boy, Ernest Elmore, was shot and wounded with a .32 caliber slug to his shoulder after that teen had left the location of an after-school dance, an aspect of that incident being eerily similar to what had been one of the root causes for the Lower East Side gang war that erupted 2 days earlier. Then, 5 days after that incident in Jamaica Queens that wounded Ernest Elmore, a week after the Lower East Side gang war that took the lives of Theresa G. and Julio Rosario, across town in a Hell's Kitchen playground, another youth gang incident would take the lives of two 16-year-old boys, Bobby Young and Tony Krzazinski, while injuring a third, Ewald Reimer, and emotionally scarring 2 others, the siblings Sandy and Billy Lucan. That incident, which the press would dub the Cape Man murders, due to eyewitness accounts of the black, red-lined nurse's cape worn by the alleged leader of the assault, 16-year-old Salvador Agron, would later serve as the basis for an ill-fated Broadway musical play helmed by music legend Paul Simon decades later. These incidents in New York, along with reports of street gang attacks upon prominent members of Washington, D.C.'s political elite, notably the widow of the Secretary of Defense and the wife of the senator from South Dakota, as well as a gang beating visited upon Washington, D.C. patrolman William McGinnis in early September of 1959, reduced the deaths of Theresa G. and Julio Rosario to a footnote in the long list of youth gang incidents that concerned late 50s newsreaders, both nationally and even internationally, during the late summer and early fall of 1959.
Following the death of Theresa G., do you feel, given the available resources at the time, that Chauncey Kilmer Meyers' LENA, Lower East Side Neighborhood Association, was able to offset additional gang violence? Did they do a quote-unquote good job with what they had, all things considering, in the wake of this tragedy?
Great question. On September 2, 1959, 10 days after the death of Theresa G., a conference was held by community organizers where they discussed their concerns about the gang activity that led to Theresa G's death and how future gang activity would lead to more violence. They were taking it seriously. Between August 31 and September 1, there was one particular sportsman who continually went into Forsyth Street area to provoke a gang conflict with them. This is after Theresa G's death. He was described as, I quote, a hardcore gang member and one of the leaders of the Sportsmen. And this leader of the Sportsmen tried to recruit a younger group of sportsmen to come along with him. And the notoriety of this particular member of the Sportsmen was so bad that LENA, the youth board, and Father Meyers all recommended that this particular sportsman be removed from the community. Father Meyers himself said that this youth was difficult and unresponsive to counseling. Father Meyers and many other people, they were on guard and they were taking action. In February 1960, there was still tension in the neighborhood. There was a situation at St. Augustine, a dance that they hosted, where both sides, and that's a quote, both sides were packing. One with a knife and one with a piece, which for those who aren't familiar with gang terminology, that's a gun too. I also came across this interesting case of a sportsman who was arrested for a break and enter in July 1960. And he was put on probation, and there was some bits of information in regards to the gang situation on the Lower East Side that I saw in his file. This member of the Sportsmen was arrested on January 16, 1961 in Forsyth turf. He had been attacked and hit on the head, most likely by the Forsyth boys. According to the member of the Sportsmen, this attack was because he was a member of the Sportsmen, and, I emphasize this, it was related indirectly to the killing of Theresa G. So the gang situation was so bad for this member of the Sportsmen that in June 1961, he actually moved to Brooklyn. Sometimes they would try to get out of the situation by moving away from the area. And that was because the rivalry was so intense. And so he was attacked. This would be early 1961. Just a reminder, August 22, 59 was when Theresa G was killed. So the tension was there in 1961. And so, in my opinion, knowing that the neighborhood was still tense, in that situation in 1961, I would say that Father Meyers was doing a pretty good job. In fact, if he wasn't doing a good job, I wouldn't have been surprised if there would have been another murder.
The gang war on Manhattan's Lower East Side ended on August 23, 1959. The tally? 2 young lives cut down, several others, including innocent bystanders, seriously injured, along with other unrelated teen gang conflicts flaring up in both New York and around the country following the Sportsmen Forsyth gang war. And yet, for reasons already shown, these tragedies are largely forgotten today. For today's mainstream, this is the image of the 1950s teen gang member. A lovable, child-friendly mascot of feel-good nostalgia. More funny than frightening. More a symbol of supposed innocence of a simpler and carefree time, rather than a focus of serious social concern. And yet, the questions that came in the wake of the murders of the teens Theresa G. and Julio Rosario, even as 11-year-old Manuel Cintron and teens Ernestine Singleton and Robert Combs were recovering from their wounds, questions regarding poverty, substance abuse, parental neglect, and armed violence were eerily similar to concerns we voice today when looking at violent crime among today's modern young. That concern, of course, would give rise to several beloved works of art, on stage and on screen, the latter of which has now surpassed the real-life inspirations that gave urgency to such works. Carol Lawrence, the stage actress who originally played Maria for the Broadway version of West Side Story 4 years before Natalie Wood would bring the character to life on the big screen, gave her insight as to why the iconic update of Romeo and Juliet, set amidst the backdrop of 1950s New York gang warfare, was so important, relevant for its time.
The crisis across the nation, in any inner city, was that the gangs were literally killing each other. There was turmoil, there was violence, there was disaster. And we attacked that in theater, which is the best way. You hold up a mirror to society and you say, what are you going to do about it, Buster? This is what's happening. And we really hit a core because that was where we were hurting.
We had an actual gang come backstage.
Yes. They came and literally challenged the dancers to a rumble.
Some of them had never been to Manhattan before.
Right.
With nail files and with their girls in their snakeskin jackets and their wine. And here we are literally confronting a gang that their lives are spent with gang warfare.
Given what we know now regarding 1950s gang conflicts, it is perhaps ironic that some very vocal and influential individuals utilize and even politicize nostalgia for the 1950s, often accompanied with the sanitized parody of the 1950s teen gang member as nostalgia's visual mascot for a return to a supposed crime-free time before armed teen violence. Many of today's parents, and even grandparents, will often costume their young family members, children and preteens, in the stereotype of the 1950s teen gangster, as a way of introducing their children to good, clean, wholesome 1950s style fun for themed parties, while often blissfully unaware that during the summer of 1959, other children, not much older than the ones these well-meaning modern-day adults outfit their young in 50s greaser costumes, had been felled, having lost their lives to the gang lifestyle, that is, the actual, real-life gangs of the 1950s.
He's not a